Hey everyone. Today I have a bit of a special review or discussion. Although I don't normally review movies on my channel, and I don't really plan to make a habit out of it, I just watched the 2019 movie Knives Out last night, and I really felt inspired to spend some time discussing it. With all the time I've spent reading Agatha Christie and a few other detective mysteries lately, I feel like that gave me a special appreciation of how this modern detective story brings together the best elements of its distant predecessors, and also how it keeps from ever feeling stale or simply just another reiteration of the same old concept. The plot of this movie revolves around a death by apparent suicide of a renowned mystery writer following his 85th birthday party. While we meet a varied cast of characters in the family throughout the movie, much of the exposition and exploration is performed through the eyes of Marta Cabrera, a sympathetic young woman who worked as a nurse and sort of a companion for the deceased man, and who was present on the night of the writer's death, and therefore finds herself wrapped up in the heart of what soon develops, to her horror, into a full-blown murder investigation. If it wasn't already clear from my introduction, I loved this movie. I went in not knowing much about it, other than having a general sense that it was critically well received and that it involved some element of mystery. I didn't realize just how much this movie owes to classic detective fiction, though, a fact that its makers obviously are well aware of. Still, although this movie appears at first to be another instantiation, albeit a pretty good one, of the same tried and true detective stories, it very quickly changes into something quite different and totally fresh, but without ever doing so in a way that feels forced or like a slight to classic detective fiction. It's clear that the writers knew the rules they were breaking and how to break them in a satisfying way. And I think the reason this is clear is because, first of all, the very breaking of the rules forms a big element of the surprise of this movie. Each time an expectation is flipped, it creates a very satisfying effect for fans of the genre, but I think it even will for non-regulars in the detective fiction genre, because for an early example, I don't think anyone would expect in a mystery to know quite as much information about the crime scene as we learn pretty early on. And second of all, it's clear they know what they're doing because there are certain staples of the genre that are fully respected or cleverly resurrected in new forms. I suspect, though, that Agatha Christie herself would have really appreciated this modern take on detective fiction, perhaps even more so than some of the recent adaptations of her own novels that often seem to miss some of what really gave those novels life. But before I say any more on this, I'm just going to give a brief warning that the rest of this review will contain spoilers, so if you haven't watched this movie yet, I highly recommend you go out and experience it yourself before listening any further. Okay, getting into the spoilers now. The way this mystery was set up and revealed was ingenious. Not knowing anything about what to expect because this movie isn't part of a continuing series or anything, at least it wasn't yet, we can never be quite certain just where it's all going. And thus the first huge surprise comes about 30 minutes into the movie when we're told pretty conclusively who the murderer is. It was an accident. It's our heroine, Marta Cabrera, if you haven't actually seen the movie. And we're told what the consequences are going to be for her and her family if she's caught, and they are quite dire. Her mom is probably going to get deported. And thus, unlike our typical whodunit in which we try to piece together what happened and find the guilty party, it appears that this movie is going to be the exact opposite, a movie in which the guilty party in a tragic accident must, with the help of the victim, cover her tracks perfectly so that the detective cannot figure out what really happened. In this way, the killer becomes the hero and the detective becomes the antagonist. Not to mention the way in which this information about Marta's involvement is revealed is perfectly executed. Before this point, any amateur detectives in the audience will have already started piecing together the facts in the scene. It doesn't quite all add up yet, but it seems like Marta is the only person who could have done it. Is this going to be another case of the sympathetic and attractive young woman playing everyone for the fool and just making off with the fortune? And just a few minutes before this scene, in which Marta reflects on what happened, we may have also noticed that she appears visibly upset in a flashback when she's leaving the house at midnight, conspicuously announcing to Walt that she's leaving. So for a while, it seems like this is exactly where the movie is going, because at first Marta covers her tracks so well until the cracks start opening. And from then, it's only a little while before the dam is bursting, and it becomes increasingly impossible to imagine this ruse actually working. And this is another part of the movie that I really loved, because this plan is just so airtight until suddenly it's absolutely not. And then once it's not, things just really start falling apart in every possible way. The sheer level of inconvenience is staggering. And to top it all off, we have this goofy element, but one that I think actually works, of Marta being physically unable to tell a lie. The fact that once we've bought into it makes her both more sympathetic and makes it seemingly impossible that she's ever going to get away with it. Actually, that element, I admit, was maybe one tiny instance where it was a little bit much, especially since she then manages to circumvent it whenever it's convenient. Although never in a way that's so convenient as to really be disappointing. I think this is one minor point where the writers took a shortcut to achieve an effect they wanted, but there are plenty of other inconveniences too. For example, I think many of us could see exactly what was coming at the reading of the will, even though we're dreading it. The leaving of the entire fortune to Marta is the most inconvenient possible outcome imaginable. The one thing that will turn everyone's attention against this girl, to whom none of them except the detective has really paid much attention. And despite knowing who the killer is and how it happened, it never will feel to the audience like everything is already solved. First of all, fans of the genre will probably still have this question in the back of their minds, as they should. Is there any way in which everything might not be how it appeared to be, even how it appeared to Marta herself? Could it be that the victim, a mystery writer himself, is staging some horrible trick where he swapped the bottles in Marta's hand while she wasn't looking, only to create the appearance that he'd been poisoned? Well, aside from that being a really cruel trick to play on Marta, he did ultimately slit his own throat, so unless there was some possible way of staging that as well, which really seems impossible since his body was there and conclusively ruled dead, it seems pretty indisputable that he's toast. Okay, so is there some other way that another party could have orchestrated it so that Marta would make this mistake? Well, it's possible, but it seems kind of unlikely because she did, after all, have two bottles, both of them clearly labeled. It's not like she looked at the bottles after the fact and saw that they were both morphine. And as I was writing this review, I actually had to think about why didn't the killer just mix them so that they were both morphine? But I realized there is a good reason for this, because if they were both morphine, then it would be obvious that someone had tampered with them. Anyway, that's one line of thought that should hopefully keep us guessing at least a little bit, even if we haven't figured out the details. But what if audience members aren't so inherently skeptical? What if they take it at face value that Marta killed the old man and it happened exactly as she reported? But the writers put in a clever detail that makes it so that this should never happen. No one should ever be fully satisfied until the very end if they're paying attention. And that is the fact that our detective, Benoit Blanc, says early on that he's only here because someone anonymously hired him and that is making him very uneasy. Thus, we all know from early on that it's only by figuring out why this happened that we'll really have the complete picture understood. And there are clues galore for the viewer to pick up on, but never so many as to make things feel too easy. In fact, if there was any weakness to the whole mystery setup, it's that it was all contrived almost too well, something for which the writers can hardly take blame. It was just super airtight of a mystery, and because of that, occasionally there were these clues that, to be honest, I doubted at first whether they were even clues, because they seemed like the kind of things the writers could be using simply as shortcuts to advance the plot. For example, one thing early on that caught my attention was, would a go board knocked off of a short table onto the floor really make such a loud thud that it would wake people sleeping in the room beneath? But even here, if we were doubting that we had picked up on a real discrepancy, the writers then give us a chance 15 minutes later to see that, yes, if we noticed this, we were correct. It wasn't the go board, but actually Marta falling on the floor that made this thud, something much more consistent with actual observations. And thus, later in the movie, for example, when maybe we are a little suspicious that the character Ransom knows precisely that Marta needs to check her email to figure out how to retrieve the incriminating toxicology report, we might wonder at first whether we're really picking up on something or if it's just a convenient way for the writers to advance the plot. But then we remember these earlier clues, and hopefully we give the writers credit that maybe this was in fact an intentional hint. So finally, there are the characters. Marta is a fun and likable protagonist with lots of heart, visibly and convincingly terrified at everything this case involves, but also strong-willed in her efforts to achieve what she and the audience will suspect to be true justice. In this way, she fits the mold of many of Agatha Christie's more convincing and interesting female leads or co-investigators, the ones who seem too sympathetic and too transparent to the reader to really be possibly guilty. But she also comes to life to an extent beyond that which even Christie's best protagonists typically achieved in the written form. And then our cast of suspects from the family, as we meet them in the first 15 minutes, may already seem a little shifty or unlikable, as is often the case in this kind of mystery, but they become progressively more so as the plot advances, and we see just how they turn out when the prospect of disinheritance is facing them. We'd absolutely love it to turn out that any of them is the killer. We've pretty much been shown that it isn't the case, but we might still have some doubts because we just can't bear for these people to come out on top. And because wouldn't that be perfect if they actually were all disinherited? Finally, there's our detective, Benoit Blanc, and he's, well, I have to admit, it took me about 15 to 30 minutes for me to fully process that this was Detective Benoit Blanc and not Detective James Bond, since actor Daniel Craig has taken on both of those roles. But once his character began to develop, I think he really worked for me. Like most detectives of detective fiction, he's quite cryptic and remains so to the end. And his role in the movie is an especially important one, as he alternatingly plays the role of both the hero and the antagonist. And thus, it's up to the viewers to piece together from his personality whether he's ultimately on Marta's, and therefore probably the viewer's side, or against her. And Craig's performance, along with the character writing, really managed to convey this uncertainty and unpredictability. We get the sense that he's committed to getting to the real bottom of this case, although we have some doubt as to whether he's actually making any progress, which turns out maybe to be wrong in the end. He does know what he's doing more than you might think partway through. But we also get the sense that, like many of the best detectives of classic detective fiction, he's concerned not only with justice in the eyes of the law, but also with a deeper sense of justice and fairness. It's not enough for him just to put someone behind bars and then call it a day. And while maintaining all the intrigue and really the gravitas of a famous detective like Hercule Poirot, Detective Blanc somewhat lacks the same air of self-importance and even the same outwardly visible competence. It still seems he has these things, but he demonstrates them by what he does rather than through a very visible self-awareness of these things. In one of the movie's most perfectly self-aware moments, Detective Blanc and Miss Cabrera sit side by side at a fireplace. The young woman having pretty much been thwarted, but also believing she's basically just solved the case for him by telling him all the things that he needed to know and was not able to figure out by himself, sort of jokes gloomily, "You're not much of a detective," to which he sort of half smiles and responds, "Well, you're not much of a criminal either." This particular exchange, rare within the context of detective fiction, really illustrates part of what was unique for me about this movie among its peers. In stark contrast with the scene of, say, the pompous Hercule Poirot needling one of his more formidable foes to try to coax the final piece of information out of her, this movie comes down to not much of a detective contending with not much of a criminal. Of course, this scene is only a build-up to the actual stunning conclusion, and both of these characters are actually much more than they admit to be in this scene. But it's the fact that each one is fundamentally able to even admit to being not much of a something that typifies this movie's character. So the writers of Knives Out really managed to make something special, and they achieved this by clearly anticipating the ways in which they could go wrong or mislead the audience in the wrong, unsatisfying sort of way, and then accounting for these gaps. In fact, I'd hate to be put up against the folks who wrote this movie in an actual murder case because they seem to have accounted for every one of the normal pitfalls so thoroughly. This mystery is gripping to the very end, but beyond that, this mystery has a lot of heart. Something that's so easy to get wrong in detective fiction by letting the mystery compensate for rather soulless characters. The movie delivers suspense in the right way for a mystery of its kind, never stooping to the level of cheap thrills or using unjustifiable developments that serve merely to advance the plot. And you'll always know as you're watching this one that things are going to turn out all right in the end. Well, except for the dead guy, but that's usually an unavoidable casualty in a murder mystery. He lived a good life, though. Have you seen this movie? What did you think? I know there's going to be a sequel or just next in series coming out soon with a limited release. Actually, it might be out for real by the time I've got this up. And I heard that one's pretty good too, so I'll definitely be watching that one this year on my Christmas vacation. Anyway, I'll see you soon and hope you enjoy the review. Happy sleuthing and happy December.